It was a quiet, unremarkable evening in the heart of Edgewood Heights, a neighborhood where every driveway had a minivan, every yard was neatly trimmed, and every face seemed to wear a smile. Among the tidy homes on Sycamore Lane was the house of Chloe and Mark Rivers, a couple who, to anyone looking in, had a life worth envying. Chloe, 32, was a well-loved middle school teacher known for her patience and warmth. Her students described her as the kind of teacher who could make anyone feel special. Mark, a 34-year-old paramedic, was the kind of man you'd want showing up in an emergency. Together, they seemed like the perfect team, a couple who balanced each other effortlessly. They were the heart of their community. Barbecues, game nights, charity events. If something was happening in Edgewood Heights, you could count on Chloe and Mark to be part of it. Friends described them as generous and down-to-earth, the kind of couple everyone wanted to be around. But what truly stood out about Chloe and Mark was their bond. Whether it was the way they laughed at each other's jokes or how Mark would instinctively reach for Chloe's hand when they walked, their connection felt genuine, a rarity in today's world. For Chloe and Mark, life wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling. They shared their days in the small rituals of love, texting each other during lunch breaks, staying up late watching their favorite crime dramas, and debating over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, a life built on trust, love, and a shared dream of growing old together. Chloe and Mark Rivers were a picture of happiness, but on this quiet street in Edgewood Heights, appearances would soon prove to be deceiving. It was a few months after their 10th wedding anniversary when Chloe began to notice subtle changes in Mark. At first, they seemed insignificant. He was working longer hours, often coming home later than usual, and when he did, he seemed distracted, lost in thought. Chloe chalked it up to the stress of his job as a paramedic. After all, the work wasn't easy, and Mark often bore the weight of other people's emergencies on his shoulders. Still, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She began noticing small, uncharacteristic behaviors, unanswered calls, text messages read but not replied to, and moments when Mark seemed unusually defensive when asked about his day. It wasn't in Chloe's nature to assume the worst, so she let it go, until the night she found the receipt. It was an ordinary Thursday evening. Mark had fallen asleep on the couch after dinner, and as Chloe was tidying up, she noticed a crumpled piece of paper sticking out of his jacket pocket. It was a receipt, nothing unusual, except it wasn't from any place she recognized. A small, cozy cafe downtown. The date and time were clear. A Wednesday afternoon when Mark was supposedly on a call. Her heart sank, but she convinced herself there had to be an explanation. She asked Mark about it the next morning, careful to keep her tone light. He smiled and dismissed it, saying he'd grabbed a quick coffee between calls. It made sense, and yet something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he had anticipated the question. Chloe didn't press further, but the moment stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, Chloe began to piece together a pattern, disjointed fragments of a life that didn't quite align. Mark's schedule seemed less predictable, his affection more sporadic. He began leaving early for work, and on more than one occasion, Chloe found herself alone at events they'd always attended together. Friends asked about Mark's absence, and though she always had an excuse ready, the explanation started to feel hollow even to her. It wasn't until a chance encounter with a mutual friend that Chloe's suspicions deepened. They ran into each other at the grocery store, exchanging pleasantries, when the friend casually mentioned seeing Mark at the same downtown cafe, this time, not alone. Chloe tried to maintain her composure as the friend described the scene. Mark sitting across from a woman, laughing, leaning in close. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it was enough to make Chloe's world tilt on its axis. Chloe didn't confront Mark right away. Instead, she began keeping track of his schedule, noting the days when his stories didn't quite add up. She started checking his phone when he wasn't looking, but Mark had become careful, locking his device and keeping it within reach at all times. Still, she found small clues, an unfamiliar name in his call log, a message deleted before she could read it. Each discovery added to the growing knot in her stomach. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, Chloe sat in their living room, staring at the blank screen of the television. Her mind raced with questions she didn't know how to ask, let alone answer. She wanted to trust him, to believe that there was an innocent explanation for all of it. But deep down, she knew that trust was already starting to fracture. It was then that Chloe made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter what it took. She reached out to a friend who worked in IT, asking for help accessing Mark's locked phone. At first, she hesitated, feeling guilty about invading his privacy. But the nagging doubt was too much to bear. The friend reluctantly agreed, and a week later, Chloe held the unlocked phone in her trembling hands. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Messages between Mark and a woman named Vanessa painted a picture of a relationship far more intimate than any friendship. Late-night texts, inside jokes, plans to meet at the cafe. There was no denying it now. Chloe felt her chest tighten as she scrolled through the exchanges, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. She confronted Mark that night. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sat silently as she read the messages aloud, her voice trembling with betrayal. When she finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, he offered a half-hearted apology, but there was no remorse in his tone, only frustration at being caught. For Chloe, this wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a betrayal of the life they had built together, the trust they had shared, and the promises they had made. She told Mark she wanted a divorce, and for the first time in their relationship, she saw a side of him she had never seen before. His calm demeanor cracked, revealing anger, cold, controlled, but unmistakable. He argued, pleaded, and finally lashed out, accusing her of overreacting, of trying to ruin his life. Chloe stood her ground, determined to end the charade. She started making plans to move out, to rebuild her life without him. But as she began to take steps toward her freedom, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't done with her yet. Before we continue, we noticed that over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy gripping true crime stories like this, please support us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss an update. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. In the days following their confrontation, Chloe began to notice subtle changes in Mark's behavior. He seemed calmer, almost unnervingly so, as if the storm had passed, and he had accepted the inevitable. He offered to help with the logistics of the separation, selling the house, dividing their finances, and even suggested they could remain friends. But beneath the surface of his seemingly cooperative demeanor, Chloe felt an undercurrent of tension, like a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. Then came the gifts. Out of nowhere, Mark started leaving small tokens for her. Flowers on the kitchen counter, a handwritten note apologizing for his mistakes, even a bracelet he'd claimed reminded him of their honeymoon. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a man trying to make amends, but to Chloe, it felt off. These weren't gestures of reconciliation. They were attempts to regain control, and they only added to her unease. One evening, Chloe returned home late from a meeting with her divorce lawyer to find Mark waiting for her in the driveway. His car was parked at an angle, blocking hers from pulling in. He stepped out as she approached, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the porch light. His smile was wide, but his eyes didn't match the expression. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Chloe hesitated, gripping the handle of her car door. "It's late, Mark," she replied. "Can we do this tomorrow?" But he shook his head, stepping closer. "No, Chloe, this can't wait." Chloe reluctantly followed him inside, her heart pounding as she stepped into the house they once shared. Mark gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table, and she noticed 2 glasses of wine already poured. She refused the drink, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, and began to speak. "I know I've made mistakes," he began, "but you're making a mistake too. Throwing everything away like this. We can fix it. We just need time." Chloe shook her head, her voice steady but strained. "Mark, it's over. You need to accept that." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. Chloe left as soon as she could, her hands shaking as she started her car and drove away. That night, she called a close friend, relaying the encounter in a hushed, panicked tone. "He's not letting go," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." Her friend urged her to stay cautious, even suggesting she stay elsewhere for a while. But Chloe brushed it off, insisting she could handle it. She had always been strong, and she wasn't going to let Mark intimidate her. In the weeks that followed, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began showing up unannounced, at her work, at her gym, even at a local cafe where she was meeting friends. Each time, he had an excuse. He was just passing by, or he needed to talk about something important. Chloe started to feel like she was being watched, even in the safety of her own home. Then came the calls, late at night, sometimes with no one on the other end. Chloe changed her number, but somehow, he always found a way to contact her. One evening, she received an email from an anonymous account. It contained a single line: "You think you're safe, but you're not." She reported it to the police, but without proof that it was Mark, there was little they could do. Chloe decided it was time to take a bigger step. She filed for a restraining order, providing the court with evidence of Mark's harassment. The order was granted, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Mark didn't take the order as a warning. He took it as a challenge. One night, Chloe came home to find her living room in disarray. The coffee table had been knocked over, picture frames shattered on the floor. Her first thought was a burglary, but nothing was missing. The door hadn't been forced open. And then she saw it. A photo of her and Mark from their wedding day, torn in half, with only her side left intact. The message was clear. Terrified, Chloe contacted the police again, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do beyond filing another report. She confided in her friends and family, who begged her to leave the house, to stay somewhere safe. But Chloe, determined not to let Mark control her life any longer, decided to stay. She installed new locks, added security cameras, and kept her phone close at all times. But none of it felt like enough. The tension in her life was suffocating, and the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with each passing day. Chloe didn't know what Mark was planning, but she knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. Chloe's neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Dalton, was out walking her dog when she noticed something unusual in Chloe's front yard. At first, it seemed like a pile of discarded mail scattered across the grass. But as she approached, she saw that it wasn't mail. It was a series of photos. Pictures of Chloe, taken through her windows, in the car, even in her gym parking lot. Mrs. Dalton immediately called Chloe, who rushed outside to see for herself. As she picked up the photos, her hands trembled. Someone had been watching her, and they wanted her to know it. Chloe turned the photos over and found a note taped to the back of one of them. It read, "You can't run from me." This time, there was no question who was responsible. She took the photos and the note to the police, who opened an official investigation. For the first time, there was physical evidence that Mark's harassment had escalated. But for Chloe, it wasn't enough. She still didn't feel safe. The investigation began with the police questioning Mark, who, as expected, denied everything. He claimed he had been trying to respect Chloe's boundaries since the restraining order was issued and suggested that someone else must be trying to scare her. He pointed fingers at an old co-worker of hers, even going so far as to offer a name. But the police weren't convinced. While Mark's behavior seemed polished and cooperative, they noted inconsistencies in his statements. Still, without concrete proof, they had no grounds to detain him. Chloe's fears deepened when she started noticing strange things around her house. Her security cameras would glitch at odd hours, going offline for minutes at a time. Items in her home would be slightly out of place, things she was sure she hadn't moved. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then one evening, while reviewing her camera footage, she saw it. At 2:14 a.m., a figure appeared in the shadows of her backyard. It was blurry, but the build and posture were unmistakable. It was Mark. She brought the footage to the police the next morning, but Mark denied it was him. His alibi? He had been out of town for work that night, staying at a hotel 3 hours away. He even produced receipts to back up his claim. Frustrated, Chloe felt like she was trapped in a nightmare where every door to escape was slammed shut. Despite the mounting evidence against Mark, his alibis always seemed just credible enough to avoid arrest. The police grew suspicious that he was carefully orchestrating his actions to evade legal consequences. Meanwhile, Chloe's life was unraveling. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and her once vibrant social life had all but disappeared. Her friends and family urged her to leave town, to start fresh somewhere new. But Chloe refused. "Why should I be the one to leave?" she told them. "This is my home." Then came the email. Sent from an anonymous account, it contained a detailed list of Chloe's daily routine. What time she left for work, what time she came home, even the route she took to the gym. At the bottom of the email was a single line: "You're running out of time." This was the tipping point. Chloe forwarded the email to the police, who immediately escalated their investigation. The authorities began digging deeper into Mark's life. What they found was a web of deception. Bank records showed a series of unexplained withdrawals that didn't align with Mark's reported income. Surveillance footage from local hardware stores revealed him purchasing items like rope, duct tape, and gloves. Items that, when combined, painted a chilling picture. But still, none of it was enough to arrest him. As the investigation continued, Chloe started working with a private investigator. She needed answers that the police couldn't provide. The investigator uncovered a disturbing detail. Mark had been contacting an ex-girlfriend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Their conversations, while seemingly innocent, hinted at a plan. A future that didn't include Chloe. The messages spoke of starting over, moving away, and cleaning the slate. With every new piece of evidence, Chloe felt the walls closing in. The police increased patrols near her home and placed her on a high-risk watch list, but Chloe knew it wasn't enough. She began sleeping with her phone by her side, her keys within arm's reach, always ready to run. Her private investigator suggested she carry a panic button, a small device that would alert authorities if she was in danger. Chloe reluctantly agreed, but even with the added precautions, she felt the weight of Mark's presence everywhere she went. And then, one night, it all came to a head. Chloe was leaving her office late when she noticed her car parked under a dimly lit streetlight. The driver's side window was fogged over, as though someone had been leaning against it. Her heart raced as she approached, clutching her phone tightly. When she reached the car, she saw it. A single red rose, placed delicately on the windshield. She froze, looking around the empty parking lot. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, and every sound felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the hum of a distant car engine. She knew she wasn't alone. With trembling hands, she hit the panic button, triggering an alert to the police. Minutes later, patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. But Mark was nowhere to be found. The rose on the windshield wasn't just a chilling symbol, it was the tipping point for law enforcement. After months of harassment, veiled threats, and disturbing evidence, Chloe's case was elevated to a top priority. Investigators began focusing all their efforts on tracking Mark's movements, his financial records, and his communications. They knew he was meticulous, but they also believed he had made one crucial mistake: underestimating how closely he was being watched. 2 days after the parking lot incident, authorities got their break. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Mark purchasing a single rose just an hour before Chloe discovered it on her car. The timestamp on the receipt matched the estimated time he would have been in the area. It wasn't the definitive proof they needed, but it was enough to obtain a warrant to search his property. When officers arrived at Mark's home, they found a meticulously kept facade. The house was clean, his belongings organized, and nothing seemed out of place. But as they searched deeper, they uncovered a chilling discovery: a hidden compartment in his garage containing items that matched the purchases seen on the hardware store footage: rope, duct tape, gloves, and a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. Tucked away in the corner of the compartment was a burner phone, its contents encrypted. Authorities seized everything, sending the phone to a forensic lab for analysis. It took days to crack the encryption, but when they did, the findings were shocking. The phone contained messages to an unidentified recipient detailing plans to finish things and start fresh. There were also screenshots of Chloe's routine, photos of her at work, the gym, and even inside her own home. The most damning piece of evidence was a draft email, never sent, with the subject line, "Closure." Mark was arrested at a motel 2 towns over, where he had been staying under a false name. When officers apprehended him, he appeared calm, almost indifferent, as though he had been expecting it. He refused to answer any questions, invoking his right to remain silent. But his calm demeanor faltered when he was presented with the evidence against him, particularly the contents of the burner phone. Chloe was notified of the arrest, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to exhale. But the relief was short-lived. The case was far from over. Mark's defense team was formidable, and they wasted no time trying to discredit the evidence, claiming it was circumstantial and that Mark had no intention of harming Chloe. They argued that the items found in his garage were for unrelated home projects and that the messages on the burner phone were taken out of context. The trial began 6 months later, drawing widespread attention from the media. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and curious spectators, all eager to witness the unraveling of a case that had captured the public's imagination. Chloe took the stand on the second day, her voice steady but tinged with emotion as she recounted the months of terror she endured. She described the photos left in her yard, the emails, the stalking, and the moment she found the rose on her car. Mark's defense team tried to paint Chloe as overly paranoid, suggesting that she had misinterpreted his actions and exaggerated the danger. But the prosecution was relentless, presenting the evidence piece by piece. They played the gas station footage, displayed the items found in Mark's garage, and read aloud the draft email from the burner phone. Each detail painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned to harm his ex-wife. The most gripping moment of the trial came when a former coworker of Mark's took the stand. She revealed that Mark had confided in her about his frustrations with Chloe and how he felt trapped by the divorce. He had mentioned, almost casually, that he sometimes wished he could make her disappear. The courtroom fell silent as the coworker described how she had initially dismissed the comment as hyperbole, only to realize its gravity when she saw the news of his arrest. After weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. The weight of the evidence against Mark was substantial, but his defense team had planted enough seeds of doubt to make the outcome uncertain. Chloe waited anxiously in a separate room, surrounded by friends and family who had been by her side throughout the ordeal. Hours turned into days, and the tension was unbearable. Finally, the verdict was announced: guilty on multiple charges, including stalking, harassment, and attempted kidnapping. Mark's face remained impassive as the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. For Chloe, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the scars of the ordeal would remain with her forever. After the trial, Chloe spoke briefly to the media. She expressed gratitude to the investigators who had worked tirelessly on her case and urged others in similar situations to trust their instincts and seek help. "No one should have to live in fear," she said. Her words resonated with countless viewers, many of whom saw their own experiences reflected in her story. After the trial, Chloe began the slow process of reclaiming her life. The weight that had pressed down on her for months was finally lifting, but the path forward was far from easy. She moved out of the house she had shared with Mark, leaving behind not just memories, but also the lingering shadows of fear and mistrust. In her new apartment, miles away from Edgewood Heights, she focused on building a space that was truly her own, a place where she could finally feel safe. Chloe's story didn't just end with Mark's conviction. In the months following the trial, she became an advocate for others who had experienced harassment and domestic abuse. She partnered with local organizations to raise awareness about stalking and the warning signs of controlling behavior, speaking at community events and sharing her story in the hope that it might prevent others from enduring the same nightmare. "I ignored the small signs," she admitted in one of her first public interviews. "I thought I was overreacting. But if I had trusted my instincts earlier, maybe things wouldn't have gotten as bad as they did." Her honesty struck a chord, and emails began pouring in from people thanking her for her courage. Survivors shared their own stories, finding strength in Chloe's resilience. But while Chloe's public persona grew stronger, her private journey was more complicated. Trust didn't come easily anymore. She struggled with anxiety, jumping at small noises and feeling the constant need to check over her shoulder. Nights were the hardest, quiet moments when her mind would wander back to the photos, the emails, and the rows on her windshield. She began seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma survivors. Together, they worked through the layers of fear and anger that Mark had left behind. Slowly, Chloe started to find peace in small things. A walk in the park, the sound of rain against her window, the company of her golden retriever, Max, who had been her constant companion through it all. Meanwhile, the impact of the case rippled far beyond Chloe's life. Mark's conviction set a precedent for how stalking and harassment cases were handled in the local justice system. Law enforcement agencies began implementing new protocols, including faster response times and better resources for victims. Chloe's case became a training example for officers, showing the importance of taking early warning signs seriously. Through her advocacy, Chloe pushed for legislative changes, lobbying for stricter penalties for stalking and more comprehensive support systems for survivors. Her efforts contributed to the passage of a state law that expanded the definition of stalking to include digital harassment, something she had experienced firsthand. It was a small victory, but to Chloe, it represented a step toward ensuring no one else would feel as helpless as she once had. Though Chloe's life was moving forward, there were moments when the past would creep back in. Occasionally, she would receive a letter from Mark, sent from his prison cell. The letters were cold, calculating, filled with thinly veiled attempts to manipulate her. At first, she read them, trying to understand the mind of the man who had terrorized her. But eventually, she realized she didn't need to understand. She just needed to let go. She stopped opening the letters, instead handing them over to her lawyer to ensure they were documented. Years passed, and Chloe found herself growing stronger. She reconnected with old friends, started traveling, and even began dating again. But this time, she set boundaries that were clear and unwavering. "I'm not the same person I was before," she told a close friend. "And that's okay. I've learned what I need and what I won't tolerate." Chloe's story became a symbol of resilience and hope for many. Through her pain, she found purpose, using her voice to shine a light on the dark corners of relationships that too often go unnoticed. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future, for herself and for others. In one of her final public appearances, Chloe spoke to a packed auditorium, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "Surviving isn't just about getting through the bad days," she said. "It's about finding the strength to create new ones, better ones. And it's about remembering that no matter how dark it gets, there's always a way forward." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Chloe smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because she had learned to carry it differently. She had reclaimed her life, one step at a time. Chloe's journey reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable fear, courage can prevail. Her story isn't just about survival. It's about transformation, about finding strength in vulnerability, and about the power of one person's voice to spark change. While the scars of her past remain, they serve as a testament to her resilience and a reminder that no one should ever have to face such a battle alone.